Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Total War Warhammer 2. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Dwarf High Elf matchup, and in particular also the White Lions of Krace and their place in that particular matchup. So right now I think that High Elves have one of the most unfair compositions that you can take against any other faction in the way that I play against sort of the Dwarves. And the big reason for this is the way that you can use the White Lions of Krace. They're universally thought of as trashy, low-tier unit, and they are, realistically speaking. They're not a very powerful, or they're not very good as a unit. But there is this one sort of niche case where they kind of help break the sort of matchup of high elves versus dwarves. I haven't actually lost using the composition that I use against dwarves in ever, actually. The composition just fights itself. Right now, the way that dwarves can sort of counteract high elf units is a little bit weird. They can't use the conventional gun line for dwarves in a big way. They do still take some quarrelers, rangers, or whatever, but if you're hoping to sort of take out the elites with a group of thunderers in the same way that you would against, say, chaos or what have you, pretty much every high elf elite unit resists missiles in some way or another, meaning that it's a lot harder to chew through those units than you would expect. So what instead dwarves have been doing is taking things like organ guns and cannons and artillery pieces, because those are able to go through the missile block chance of the high elven lines. There are, of course, going to still be a few range type units there just to stop the high elves from having like enough archers potentially at a standoff position to snipe key units potentially, or to fight against like the I can't remember the name of that regiment right now. The Grey, that's the one. So as long as you've got a couple of those sorts of units that are capable of reacting and responding to those high elven units, then that's enough missile fire. You only need like one or two units in that particular case. So like I said, what they take instead are those artillery pieces, but they also take blasting charges. Taking something like the Ikran Miners, or the Miners with Blasting Charges, or the Norgrimlings Iron Breakers, or just regular Iron Breakers, any of those units are going to do a pretty good job of clearing out a lot of units to the front of them. They don't really worry about missile block chance, which means that the Swordmaster's ability to block things isn't going to matter as much, and the fact that Swordmasters are bunched so tightly in formation means that you could potentially deal a little bit of damage to them, especially because they've got such a high reliance on that to get through missiles, in my opinion. Even though it's only a 20% reduction in damage, it's still quite meaningful. They have got decent armor, which does block a lot of the damage from the mining charges. The mining charges are not very good at armor piercing, but the White Lions are much better at tanking through it. The White Lions have got this missile resistance of 30%, which is about equivalent to a normal bronze block chance, except it doesn't really care what the source is. It means that if you're firing at them from behind, if you're firing at them from the side, or whatever, if you're firing at them with artillery, they're going to reduce the damage by 30%. For a lot of artillery, this doesn't matter. They're still going to take that damage. But the thing is that against mining charges, against blasting charges, that means that they're going to drop the damage quite considerably from those. So even though this unit is naturally kind of squishy, the blasting charges are going to do very little. It's going to have to go through that armor, which it's already not necessarily the best at, and it's going to have to go through the 30% missile resistance check. It's also going to have to go through the fact that the White Lions are a naturally dispersed unit. Units have different densities in this game, and White Lions have one of the looser ones, meaning that less of them are going to get hit by each blasting charge. By contrast, the Swordmasters are very tightly bunched up, which means that they tend to get blown apart, even though they've got quite decent armor. Because each blasting charge is going to hit like 6 or 7 of your Swordmasters, where it might only hit like 4 or 5 of your White Lions. So there's lots of little reasons why this unit is actually quite resilient at emerging unscathed through that type of thing. Now, the next reason is because if you're taking a dwarf army composition, generally speaking, you want to be in a defensive position against high elves, and against really realistically anything. If you're playing as dwarves, your opponent sort of has to come towards you. That's just the way it is, because dwarves are so slow that they can't come to anyone else. So if you've got like that sort of an army composition, it's really just begging to be asked to be rushed by enemy units, because that's sort of how you deal with artillery right now, is you just rush the enemy composition, make sure that you kill everything, swarm around them, make it so that they don't have anyone that can block, and then you get into their artillery with whatever is sort of free after you've sort of locked up most of his front lines in combat. The White Lions of Krace are actually cheap enough that if they're used en masse against the dwarves, that they can sort of tie up a very large amount of units that are going to lose against these guys. And even if they're not going to win the fights that they're in, they're able to sort of trade cost effectively, and they do tie up more than a little bit of dwarven resources. For units that are cheaper than them, you're looking at things like Longbeards with great weapons. And the thing about Longbeards with great weapons is that they actually still lose against White Lions, I've been finding. They are a cheaper unit, so you would expect that to happen, but what I tend to find is that, of course, those dwarves are taking miners with blasting charges. They're backing those up with things like dwarf warriors. They're trying to speed bump the enemy into making it so that they are getting shot at for longer. But these units don't hold out long enough against high elven White Lion charges to really make that sort of stand. And what's more, if you are blocking with, like, say, miners with blasting charges, these things are not necessarily too inexpensive. You're really just taking them for those blasting charges to hopefully wipe out the enemy charge on the way in. Or you're sort of like blocking with dwarf warriors and you're throwing your blasting charges into your own dwarf warriors. But if you're sort of relying on that gimmick of taking the miners with blasting charges, then you're spending a lot of points on a unit that ends up not really doing anything because they, again, don't deal any damage to that unit of White Lions. And the melee defense of these guys is so low that these guys just get rolled over immediately, which is kind of fun to see in all those matches where that happens. And as well, a ton of dwarf players against high elves, they tend to take these shielded units. Like I was saying, there's no point in trying to out-missile these guys as the high elves because they're all going to be heavily armored, shielded, and stuff like that. It's going to be hard to kill them with missile units. They don't end up taking dwarf warriors with great weapons, which is a unit that I think would actually be a little bit better in this particular case. They would still lose, of course, against the White Lions. Their stats are just pretty low, but they are a very inexpensive great weapon unit. If they're taking the Longbeards with great weapons, like I said, these guys lose. They don't lose as badly, but they still lose. The thing that you need to do to actually win against these guys is either take Hammerers, which is vast overkill. You will easily overkill a unit of White Lions with a unit of Hammerers, or you tie them up with Slayers, or you tie them up with Ironbreakers, or anything like that. Like, the Ironbreakers actually beat them despite not being armor-piercing. But any of these units is quite expensive, meaning that if you've taken these guys, you don't have room for the artillery or whatever, or you've diluted your line. Because as the High Elves, what I'm looking to do is just build a melee line that's capable of spamming its way through you. Generally speaking, my composition tends to look something like this. I'd like to take this with this, and we go ahead and take the high magic here with this thing. So we're looking at a composition that looks a little bit like this with high elves, and this is what I would use in the example sort of battle there. Yeah, like, this sort of composition means that to sort of counteract this, my opponent would have to have an awful lot of high-quality infantry if he wants to actually win any of these fights. The alternative is he uses lower-cost blockers and is able to use those missile units effectively, but like I said, the White Lions actually go through low-cost blockers for the dwarf line pretty effectively. Like, realistically speaking, this grade of troop is designed and committed for defeating low-tier, heavily armored units. The problem is this game just does not have low-tier, heavily armored units. The one exception to that is with the dwarves. So the dwarf player is kind of caught in a weird situation. He can either sort of try to load up his army with things like Peak Guard, Hammers, Ironbreakers. Like, if you went with an army that sort of looked like this maybe, and you took maybe Rune Priest, Rune Lord or something like that, you take like a Rune Priest, you're looking at a fairly small army. You've spent a lot of points already there. Then you maybe take some of these Longbeards, just sort of give you a bit of width. You're kind of, you know, ending up with an army that's not going to have any room for missiles. And the question is going to be, like, do these guys beat the Swordmasters? And actually, like, the Hammers don't beat Swordmasters if the Swordmasters are being properly cared for at all. If he takes a single, like, Dragon Breath, this army cannot actually fight back against a dragon. Like, it can't fire at the dragon or whatever. So maybe you have to take some missile units. But if you're doing that, then this is already weaker than the front line that the High Elves are taking. So to do this, like, now you've got a front line that's stronger than the High Elves. You've got really no points left over for missiles. Maybe you take 3 of these. That's going to be all you've got there for sort of range units. So these guys are all going to lose. These guys are going to probably lose. This guy's going to probably crush, like, everything that he comes near. But you're ending up in a sort of weirder and weirder sort of state in this particular matchup where, you know, it becomes so far removed from what the dwarves are generally capable of doing and what they generally like to do. That's really hard to actually play this as the dwarves, because you can't compel the High Elves to come fight you in any sort of scenario. And there's been a few dwarf players that have been using more effective builds against me, but broadly speaking, it's kind of tricky for them to come up with a counteraction to the build that I've been using. I think that Giant Slayers actually would be a really good addition for a lot of the people I've been playing against. But anyway, let's take a look at a battle and see sort of what I was talking about here. like I said, I think this is currently the least fair sort of composition. Now, this player actually is taking great weapons, and like I said, a lot of players just do not take enough great weapons against High Elves. You can see that he's got a couple of those Bugsman Rangers, he's got a couple of units with blasting charges, but yeah, like, this line has just got too many support elements that are going to end up doing very little. Now, he actually does a fantastic job of clearing out some of my elite high-tier units, but there's just so many of them that he's going to have to take out. Even the White Lions in this context are able to break through a lot of his stuff really quickly. He's only got one unit that will reliably hold, and that's the Slayers. Because that's, well, and the Iron Breakers. The Iron Breakers will reliably hold against anything, but yeah, so this is just a wide old line of White Lions. They're going to run forward and they're not going to take that much damage. We are going to try and disrupt these miners so that they don't actually deal as much damage. What I should have actually done is run my mage over to here and done the blasting on the Iron Breakers rather than on these guys, but I kind of wanted to disrupt their ability to do that. So yeah, I've got the Dragon. The reason I like the Star Dragon is that I can get a flank shot on important units like the Iron Breakers, because it will actually go across the side and kill a lot of the Iron Breakers, or deal a lot of damage to their health, which is sort of what we're looking to do there. Getting some shots over here as well into the minus blasting charges. I think I did some damage and didn't actually kill very many of them. Like, it looks like one of them died. Big deal, but yeah, here comes that artillery. Like I said, the White Lions are actually quite dispersed, so if he does get a hit there, it's not going to do the same kind of damage. Rune Lord coming around here, Runesmith, blah blah blah, that's all fine. Yeah, he gets that big hit in there, and it's only killed 7 of them despite getting 2 big hits with a rock galabber sort of thing. 2 more kills with another hit, so these are not the worst in terms of hits there. Get an arrow down into the Iron Breakers, and I don't even think I damaged them. But yeah, nice Soul Squench right along the flank of that unit of miners. Kills actually half a unit there, but more importantly, they're going to reform. They're going to start firing their blasting charges off over here. Boom, boom, boom. But yeah, basically no damage to these White Lions. And these guys are just going to get like rolled over immediately. They're fighting a mage, but who cares about the mage there? What's important is that charge actually breaks them before they even get in contact. So yeah, Iron Breakers, they're going to take a big breath weapon here. Like I said, they're one of the few units that can actually threaten me here. And he started firing away at like my mage. It's also hitting my White Lions, but you know, not really a concern there. White Lions again taking those blasting charges, but not really caring. It's just not the way to deal damage against these guys. And look at that breath attack there. It's just such a good one. I don't actually do the proper thing here. I should have just actually charged against these guys. I end up giving a charge order against these long gears with great weapons. But we're basically going to sort of attack there. I basically just issued a big attack order. We're actually attacking to the front of these Grumbling Guard with White Lions and Sword Masters, and I'm going to lose over there. That's perfectly fine. I don't really give a crap. Over here, though, like, he's having a hard time sort of defending everywhere against all the stuff I have. He's actually fighting in the lead with these Buggling Rangers. I've got Slayers and White Lions, Longbeards all mixed together in this fight here. He's trying to move to get these Slayers and bring to my dragon. Finally actually moving some units around the flank here like a smart person would, but yeah, Longbeards against Sword Masters. I could have actually just sent a unit of White Lions in that fight. It would have been fine. Getting another unit of White Lions to start moving around the flank there because I can. But yeah, like we've basically just done the most mindless of possible attacks here. I've just sort of basically attack moved into his army, which is how mindless this army is. I've rushed far too quickly for his artillery to get great effect, even though I'm not going after him properly. I wish I had actually held there a little bit longer, because I charge into here against his stuff with my mage. For some reason, he just bumps into the organ gun. His tapping is terrible, but what's interesting to me is that my mage seems to be attacking the organ gun itself. It's kind of like staggering a couple of these guys, but for the most part, does not seem to be attacking the dwarf. Seems to be actually just attacking the gun itself. Kills one of the guys, but the guy's like blocking the cannon with his body. Over here, like he's gonna do fine in this fight to a certain extent. Slayer's holding up pretty well against me, but like over here just gets crushed. And you can see this is what I was talking about in terms of like support fire being important. Grumbling Guard are able to deal a lot of damage because these units were getting shot at so much with artillery, so they fled from the fight. Bring them back in though, and he needs to keep these Grumbling Guard over here so that they can sort of continue helping with that. Over here though, like, managed to sort of break through these Buggling Rangers. We're going to continue breaking through into the Grumbling Guard over here while I send my dragon probably into, I think if I recall correctly, I send my dragon over to the Goblobber, take that out there.
Weapons ready.
You can see that, like, as well, Swordmaster is sort of spread out once they get in a couple fights, so it's kind of unfair to fire artillery later in the game where it becomes less effective until you sort of form blobs, but it's kind of just the way the game works. Here you can see again, like, the spray of fire from that organ gun. The organ guns are actually still fantastic. Like, they still work out pretty well. But into melee combat with great swords against the Swordmasters against Bugman Rangers, they're just... Bugman Rangers are not necessarily that well equipped for this, but the health disparity is so extreme. Either way, though. But yeah, like, really, the reason that I'm able to win this one is because of those White Lions. There's just so many of them that he can't properly get around and fight my units the way he wants to. Too many of these units are being engaged by multiple sort of melee units in different places. He should be withdrawing with these Bugman Rangers, honestly, but it doesn't matter too much there. Don't know what the hell my mage is doing here.
Crush them!
Pathing around there. Somehow destroys the cannon after, like, having pathing issues against the cannon for like 5 minutes. Actually, I think that was probably an arrow from the dragon. Over here, you know, Swordmasters and stuff like that dealing pretty well with the Rune Lord. White Lion's still doing pretty good damage. Slayers here finally down. Like, it was a mix of the Slayers and the Longbeards with great weapons, and my White Lions won that fight. It ended up being pretty much even, like 2 units versus 2 units, despite the fact that I had a couple more in there for a little while. I pulled them out of that fight relatively quickly. But yeah, like, you need to have superior units to beat the White Lions in this particular matchup. It's one of the few ones that you do.
It is done.
I think that they made Dwarven
Seeking the foe.
sword and shield, or axe and shield units stronger, but not necessarily their great weapon units, which is kind of interesting. Their counter armor units are not necessarily that great. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of a weird matchup. This is just one of those situations. My Swordmaster's got like a ton of kills, but each of the White Lions actually did a decent amount of damage in terms of kills, even against fairly elite high-tier units. The one on the extreme right there, I know what happened to it. It got shot to pieces by the organ gun, but he had to focus that against one unit of relatively crappy White Lions of Krace, while the rest of my army is just swarming over and around all of his units. The Longbeards with great weapons, you can see, like, they did actually pretty okay. 52 kills is not that bad. I think this is the one that was mixed in with the Slayers, but they still lost that fight. The other one, 32 kills, that's, like, terrible. Longbeards over here did terrible against Swordmasters, as you would generally expect. The Ironbreakers actually held out pretty well against the White Lions. But yeah, Bugman Rangers, practically nothing. Miners Blasting Charges, literally nothing, because, well, I kind of cheesed them out beforehand. But yeah, like, this is kind of just a weird matchup right now. I think that Dwarf players might figure out a way to counteract this kind of play from the High Elves, but yeah, I mean, probably the most unfair matchup in Total War Warhammer 2 right now. So anyway, hope you found this enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.